unaware the Mafia boss he betrayed was the multi-billionaire owner of the criminal empire his gang worked for. He filmed the ambush and celebrated in his penthouse as armed rivals dragged him away in chains. What he didn't know shocked him to his core and left him with nothing. The night Jasmine Dixon's crew dragged Wesson Woodward out of the warehouse in chains, beaten and bloodied by the rival enforcers Jasmine had secretly allied with, should have been Jasmine's crowning moment, the night a young wolf finally dethroned the old king and claimed his empire. Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. But what Jasmine didn't know, what his lieutenant Marcus didn't know, what his crew didn't know as they laughed and filmed Wesson being thrown into that black van, his tailored suit torn and blood running down his weathered face, was that the Mafia boss Jasmine had just betrayed was actually Wesson Woodward, the ghost owner of the Woodward Syndicate, the multi-billion-dollar criminal empire that controlled every gang, every operation, every territory, and every dollar that Jasmine and his crew had ever touched. Every payment Jasmine received for his enforcement work, every protection fee Marcus collected as his lieutenant, every cut from the drug operations, every profit from the gambling dens, every dollar that flowed through their offshore accounts. All of it came from the syndicate the Mafia boss Jasmine betrayed actually owned. The syndicate that financed the very warehouse where Jasmine had just orchestrated his betrayal, where his crew laughed at the man who built their entire world, where Jasmine recorded the downfall of the multi-billionaire owner they were completely unaware was being dragged away in chains he'd allowed them to put on him. But Wesson didn't scream or beg as the fake blood and theatrical bruises covered his face. He just looked directly at Jasmine with those cold, calculating eyes that had seen 30 years of this game, gave the slightest knowing smile, and allowed himself to be thrown into the van that would take him exactly where he wanted to go. While Jasmine stood there in the warehouse, already wearing Wesson's stolen watch, already planning his takeover, already celebrating a victory that was actually his complete and total destruction. Because Wesson had just made a single quiet decision that would devastate Jasmine's crew, shock Jasmine to his core, and destroy everything his entire operation had built on the foundation of the criminal empire he'd betrayed without ever knowing who really owned it. The abandoned riverside warehouse had always represented everything Jasmine Dixon believed he deserved. 20,000 square feet of prime territory, multiple entry points for product distribution, perfect sightlines for security. The kind of location that screamed power to anyone who controlled it. And tonight, surrounded by his crew of 15 loyal soldiers, Jasmine had felt invincible, in control, ready to handle the Wesson problem once and for all. He'd called this meeting under the pretense of discussing territorial disputes with the South Side operations. But Jasmine's real plan was simpler, more brutal. He wanted Wesson eliminated, betrayed to the rivals, handed to the feds, erased like he'd never existed. Because in Jasmine's mind, Wesson was holding them back, playing by outdated rules when fortunes were waiting to be seized. Wesson had arrived exactly on time, with only 3 bodyguards, wearing that same understated charcoal suit he always wore. No flashy jewelry except a simple platinum watch and a family ring. No ego, no posturing, just quiet authority. Everything about him screamed old school, traditional, beneath Jasmine's generation. Jasmine had felt vindicated just looking at him. This was the man who'd commanded respect for 3 decades? This quiet, aging boss who couldn't even see the betrayal coming? Who walked into an obvious trap with only 3 men, while Jasmine had 15 soldiers, plus the 20 rival enforcers he'd secretly aligned with waiting in the shadows. Marcus, Jasmine's right hand, stood beside him wearing designer tactical gear and displaying a custom gold-plated pistol. The visual contrast was stunning. Marcus looked like ambition, like hunger, like the new generation that would dominate this city. Tyler and Dimitri, their best enforcers, flanked the exits looking ready for war. Even Vanessa, Yasmin's information broker, who'd been working both sides for the past year, stood confident in the corner, already filming the whole thing on her phone. And then there was Wesson, understated, calm, weathered, standing in their warehouse like he didn't understand the game had changed, because he didn't. Jasmine had felt a surge of power as he gave the signal. He'd spent 6 months planning this coup, convincing the South Side crews they could split Wesson's territory if they helped eliminate him. Made promises to the Italians, cut deals with the Colombians, even fed information to a federal task force that would conveniently arrive 30 minutes after Wesson was secured. Someone needed to show Wesson that the old ways were dead. Someone needed to make him understand that loyalty meant nothing in the face of opportunity, that his time was over. Yasmin had stepped forward, pulling his own weapon as the hidden enforcers emerged from the shadows. 20 armed men surrounding Wesson's tiny detail, assault rifles aimed, escape routes cut off. And without hesitation, without mercy, Yasmin had given the order. "Take him!" The warehouse had exploded into controlled chaos. Wesson's 3 bodyguards went down under a hail of strikes, professionals taking them out, without killing them, just like Jasmine had instructed. No unnecessary heat. Wesson himself had been grabbed, slammed against a support beam, hands zip-tied behind his back. Blood ran from a cut above his eye, maybe real, maybe from the small razor Dimitri had palmed for effect. His suit tore as rough hands searched him, stripped him of his phone, his watch, his dignity. And then Vanessa had started laughing. Loud, delighted laughter that filled the warehouse. She'd moved closer with her phone, capturing every second of Wesson kneeling there, bloodied, defeated, destroyed. "Oh my God!" Vanessa had gasped between laughs. "This is perfect. This is exactly what needs to happen. Yasmin, you're a legend. This is the new era." Marcus had joined the celebration, his face flushing with excitement and adrenaline, and the intoxicating rush of a coup successfully executed. "Boss, that was clean. That was perfect. He never saw it coming. Did you see his face when the soldiers came out? Like he couldn't believe someone would actually have the balls to move against him." Tyler had nodded approvingly. Dimitri grinned with satisfaction, and even the rival enforcers looked impressed by the precision of the takedown. Yasmin had pulled out his own phone, filming as 2 enforcers dragged Wesson toward the exit, recording every detail of this historic moment. "Let me be clear," Jasmine had announced to the warehouse, his voice carrying authority and triumph. "The old regime is finished. Wesson Woodward's time is done. This territory, these operations, this empire, it belongs to us now, to the ones who weren't afraid to take what we deserved." He'd walked over to where Wesson was being held, getting close enough to see the blood on his face, close enough to smell the fear he was certain the old man must be feeling. "You should have stepped down gracefully," Yasmin had said. "You should have accepted that your generation's rules don't apply anymore. But you wanted to hold on, so now you lose everything." But Wesson hadn't reacted the way Yasmin expected. He hadn't begged or threatened or tried to negotiate. He just knelt there, blood dripping from his face, hands bound behind his back, and looked directly into Jasmine's eyes. And he smiled. That strange, knowing smile that made Jasmine's stomach suddenly clench with inexplicable unease. Something was wrong. Something in Wesson's eyes, in the way he held himself despite the humiliation, in the absolute calm on his face as he was dragged toward the van, in the way he glanced at each person in the warehouse, not with fear, but with the look of someone taking inventory, documenting, recording. And then Vanessa's phone buzzed, then Marcus's, then Tyler's and Dimitri's, all at once. All with the same priority encrypted message that made Marcus's face drain of color as he read it. "Boss," Marcus whispered, his voice suddenly shaking. "Boss, we have a problem. The accounts, the offshore accounts, they're all frozen. All of them. And the safe houses are reporting security breaches. And, oh God, the South Side crews are saying the deal is off. They're pulling out. Right now." Yasmin spun toward Marcus, confusion spiking into anger. "What are you talking about? The South Side agreed to this. We had a deal." "They're saying they never agreed to anything," Marcus said, his hands shaking as more messages flooded his phone. "They're saying they were testing us. They're saying, oh no. Oh God, Yasmin, they're saying they only take orders from Woodward, from the syndicate." "What syndicate?" Yasmin demanded, his heart beginning to race with something that felt horribly like dread. But it was Vanessa who answered, her face pale, her phone forgotten in her trembling hand as she stared at Wesson with pure horror. "The Woodward Syndicate," she whispered. Oh my God, Yasmin, what did you do? What did we do?" "Vanessa, explain yourself right now," Yasmin commanded, his voice sharp with authority that suddenly felt hollow. But Vanessa couldn't speak anymore, could only stare at Wesson with the expression of someone who'd just realized they'd betrayed a king while standing in his throne room. And Wesson, still kneeling, still bound, still bleeding, just kept smiling that terrible, knowing smile. And then the warehouse's main door opened. Not violently, not dramatically, just opened with quiet authority as a man in an immaculate black suit walked in flanked by 8 professionals whose weapons and bearing marked them as true elite security. Not street soldiers like Jasmine's crew, but military-grade operators who moved with lethal precision. "I believe," Wesson said calmly, his voice carrying through the suddenly silent warehouse despite the blood on his face and the zip ties on his wrists. "It's time we had a conversation about who really owns what." The man in the black suit, older, distinguished, with the kind of presence that filled a room, pulled out a phone and pressed a single button. And simultaneously, every phone in the warehouse began to ring. Marcus's, Tyler's, Dimitri's, Vanessa's, all 15 of Yasmin's soldiers, and Yasmin's own phone, buzzing in his pocket with a number he didn't recognize but somehow knew he had to answer. The name on the caller ID made Yasmin's blood run cold. Woodward Holdings, Executive Office. 6 months earlier, Yasmin Dixon had started noticing things that irritated him. Small things at first. The way Wesson Woodward turned down the casino expansion deal in Atlantic City because it would draw too much federal attention. The way he refused to partner with the Mexican cartels on the southwestern distribution route despite the fortune they'd offered. The way he insisted on keeping operations compartmentalized, limited, controlled, when the opportunity for explosive growth was right there, waiting to be seized by someone with vision and ambition. Yasmin was 32 years old, had been in the life since he was 17, and had fought his way up from street-level enforcement to running his own crew of 15 soldiers. He'd proven himself ruthless, intelligent, hungry. He'd doubled revenue in every territory he'd touched. He'd eliminated competitors, expanded operations, and built a reputation that made other crews respect him and fear him in equal measure. And for the past 4 years, he'd been operating under Wesson Woodward's organization, believing he was working for a regional boss who controlled maybe 6 or 7 crews across the tri-state area. But lately, Yasmin had started to believe that Wesson was the problem, that the old man's conservative approach, his obsession with staying under the radar, his refusal to capitalize on obvious opportunities, that all of it was holding Yasmin back from the empire he deserved to build. Wesson was 58 years old, had been running operations since before Yasmin was born, and clearly didn't have the hunger anymore, didn't have the vision, didn't understand that the game had changed, that fortunes were being made by those bold enough to take risks, while Wesson played it safe and left money on the table. So Yasmin had started planning, carefully, methodically. The way Wesson himself had taught him to approach any major operation, with patience, intelligence, and attention to every detail. He'd begun reaching out to other crews, feeling them out, building relationships. The South Side operation run by a guy named Vincent, who seemed equally frustrated with the current structure. The Italian crew out of Brooklyn, who were always looking to expand territory. Even some Colombian distributors, who wanted direct access to the northeastern markets without going through intermediaries. Every conversation had been careful, subtle, testing the waters, seeing who might be open to a change in leadership. Who might support a coup if someone had the courage to actually execute one? And what Jasmine had discovered had excited him beyond measure. Everyone seemed frustrated with Wesson. Everyone seemed ready for new leadership. Everyone seemed to agree that the old man's time was done, and that someone younger, hungrier, more aggressive should take control. The contrast between Jasmine and Wesson had become almost comical. Wesson would arrive at meetings in his understated charcoal suits, Italian-made but conservative, no flashy labels or obvious wealth. He wore a simple platinum watch that probably cost a fortune but looked modest. He drove himself in a black sedan that could have belonged to any businessman. He conducted meetings in quiet restaurants or warehouse offices, never surrounded by more than 3 or 4 security personnel. And he spoke in that calm, measured tone that Jasmine had started to interpret as weakness rather than control. Jasmine, meanwhile, had fully embraced the aesthetic of success. He wore Balenciaga hoodies and limited edition sneakers that cost $3,000. He had diamond studs in both ears, a Cuban link chain thick enough to stop a bullet, and a Rolex Presidential that he'd taken off a rival enforcer 2 years ago. His crew dressed like him, young, hungry, expensive, dangerous. They rolled 6 deep minimum, drove blacked-out SUVs with custom rims, and made sure everyone knew exactly who they were and what they were capable of. Marcus, Jasmine's lieutenant, was cut from the same cloth. 28 years old, ruthless, loyal to Jasmine specifically rather than to any organization. He'd helped plan every detail of the coup, had been the one to actually make contact with the South Side crews, had convinced Vincent that working with Jasmine would be more profitable than whatever arrangement he currently had. Tyler and Dimitri, the enforcers, were ex-military guys who brought tactical expertise and didn't ask moral questions. Vanessa had connections everywhere, could get information on anyone, and had been instrumental in documenting Wesson's movements and schedule. The meeting was supposed to be routine. Wesson had called it himself, or at least that's what Jasmine had been told by Marcus, who'd received the message through the usual channels: territory discussion, revenue allocation, standard operational review. The kind of quarterly meeting Wesson insisted on holding with his senior crew leaders to ensure everyone understood their roles and responsibilities. Jasmine had arrived at the Riverside warehouse 90 minutes early, with his full crew of 15. He'd positioned Tyler and Dimitri at the secondary exits with 3 soldiers each. He'd placed Marcus near the main entrance with 4 more. He'd stationed Vanessa in the office overlooking the warehouse floor, where she could film everything from an elevated angle. And he'd kept 3 of his best enforcers with him on the main floor, positioned to look casual but ready to move the instant he gave the signal. Then he'd made the calls. Vincent and his South Side crew arrived 30 minutes before the scheduled meeting, entering through the north loading dock and taking positions in the shadows behind the stacked shipping containers. The Italian crew came in through the south entrance, 8 men in dark suits who moved with professional precision. Even 2 Colombian representatives showed up, not their full force, but enough to demonstrate that Jasmine had international backing for what was about to happen. By the time Wesson's black sedan pulled up to the warehouse at exactly 7 o'clock, Jasmine had 35 armed men positioned throughout the space, all committed to the coup, all ready to act. Wesson had brought 3 bodyguards. Just 3. The same 3 he always brought, professional, competent, but utterly outnumbered by the force Jasmine had assembled. Wesson stepped out of the sedan, wearing that same understated charcoal suit, looking like he was arriving at a business meeting rather than his own execution. He scanned the warehouse with those cold, calculating eyes, and Jasmine could have sworn he saw something flicker across the old man's face. Not fear, not surprise. Something else that Jasmine couldn't quite identify but that made his stomach twist with momentary unease. but the moment passed. Wesson walked into the warehouse with his 3 guards flanking him, his posture relaxed, his expression neutral. He nodded to Jasmine with that same quiet authority he always projected, as if nothing unusual was happening, as if he didn't notice the extra vehicles parked outside or the shadows of armed men positioned throughout the space. Jasmine let him get halfway across the warehouse floor before he gave the signal. A simple gesture, touching his ear with his left hand, that meant everything. The soldiers emerged from the shadows like a coordinated military operation. Vincent's South Side crew materialized from behind the shipping containers, assault rifles raised. The Italian crew moved in from the south entrance, cutting off that escape route. The Colombians appeared near the loading docks, and Jasmine's own 15 soldiers stepped forward from their positions, weapons drawn, forming a tightening circle around Wesson and his 3 guards. 35 guns, 3 targets. No possible escape. Wesson stopped walking. His 3 guards immediately moved to defensive positions, hands reaching for weapons, but they were professionals. They could read the math. 35-3. This wasn't a fight they could win. This was an execution they could only delay. Jasmine stepped forward, his own weapon drawn, but pointed at the ground. This was theater now. Performance. The moment he'd been planning for 6 months, and he wanted it recorded perfectly. He nodded to Vanessa, saw her phone camera light activate in the office window above. "Wesson," Jasmine said, his voice carrying through the warehouse with authority that felt intoxicating. "I think we need to have a different conversation than the one you were expecting." Wesson didn't respond, just stood there, calm and still, those weathered eyes fixed on Jasmine with an intensity that should have been intimidating, but that Jasmine interpreted as the desperate focus of a cornered animal. "Your 3 men need to disarm," Jasmine continued. "Now, or this gets messy in ways nobody wants." There was a long moment of silence. Then Wesson gave a small nod, and his 3 guards slowly, carefully removed their weapons and placed them on the concrete floor. Professionals to the end, smart enough to know when the game was over. "On your knees," Jasmine ordered. "All of you." Another pause. Another nod from Wesson, and then the old boss actually knelt on the dirty warehouse floor, his expensive suit pants touching concrete stained with oil and rust. His 3 guards knelt beside him, hands behind their heads, while Jasmine's soldiers moved in with zip ties and tactical efficiency. Dimitri was the one who grabbed Wesson, rougher than necessary, forcing the old man's hands behind his back and securing them with white plastic ties that bit into his wrists. Tyler moved in with the razor blade palmed in his hand, making a quick cut above Wesson's eye that immediately began bleeding. Theatrical injury, designed to look worse than it was. Perfect for the video footage Vanessa was capturing. The blood ran down Wesson's face, mixing with the dirt and sweat, and Jasmine felt a surge of power so intense it was almost physical. This was really happening. The old king was kneeling before him, bound and bleeding, while every major crew in the region watched and understood that the balance of power had fundamentally shifted. Jasmine pulled out his own phone, filming from his angle, getting close enough to capture every detail. "Let me make something very clear to everyone watching this," he announced, his voice resonating with triumph. "The old regime is finished. Wesson Woodward's time is done. His conservative approach, his outdated loyalty, his refusal to seize opportunities, all of that dies tonight." He circled Wesson slowly, camera capturing the bound man from every angle. "You could have stepped down gracefully, could have accepted that your generation's time was over and handed control to someone with actual vision. But you wanted to hold on, wanted to keep playing by rules that don't matter anymore, so now you lose everything." Marcus was laughing now, that delighted sound of victory achieved. Tyler and Dimitri grinned with savage satisfaction. Vanessa kept filming from above, capturing every second of history being made. And around the warehouse, the assembled crews watched with expressions ranging from approval to grim acknowledgement that they'd chosen the winning side. two of Vincent's South Side soldiers grabbed Wesson under the arms and hauled him to his feet. The old man's legs seemed unsteady, whether from genuine injury or theatrical performance. Yasmin couldn't tell and didn't care. What mattered was that Wesson Woodward, the man who'd controlled criminal operations for 3 decades, was being dragged toward the loading dock in chains while his would-be successor filmed it for posterity. "The van's waiting," Marcus called out, gesturing toward a black vehicle with tinted windows parked at the loading area. "Should be at the federal holding facility in about 90 minutes. Or maybe it takes a wrong turn on the way. Depends on how cooperative our guest wants to be about transferring accounts and access codes." The warehouse erupted in laughter. Cruel, victorious laughter that echoed off the metal walls and concrete floor. Yasmin's crew cheered as Wesson was lifted into the van, as the doors slammed shut, as the vehicle's engine started and began pulling away from the dock. Yasmin stood in Wesson's penthouse overlooking the Manhattan skyline at 11:30 that same night, and felt like a king surveying his kingdom. The space was exactly what he'd expected from a man who'd controlled criminal operations for 3 decades. Expensive but understated, powerful but not ostentatious. Floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city. Hardwood floors that probably cost more per square foot than most people earned in a month. Furniture that looked comfortable and lived in rather than showy. Art on the walls that Yasmin didn't recognize but that had the weight of serious money behind it. The first thing Yasmin had done after arriving was strip off Wesson's platinum watch from where Dimitri had handed it to him, taken from Wesson's wrist before he was loaded into the van, and fasten it around his own wrist. The weight of it felt right. Significant. Like a transfer of power made physical. He'd found Wesson's bourbon collection in the library, bottles that probably cost thousands of dollars each, aged whiskey from distilleries that only produced limited runs for serious collectors, and poured himself 3 fingers of a 1972 Macallan that tasted like liquid gold and victory. His crew had spread throughout the penthouse, claiming spaces, opening cabinets, exploring rooms like conquerors examining the spoils of war. Marcus had immediately gone to Wesson's office and started going through files, looking for account numbers and access codes. Tyler and Dimitri were in the security room, examining the surveillance systems, making sure they understood every camera and sensor. Vanessa had claimed one of the guest bedrooms and was already uploading footage from the warehouse to encrypted servers, creating documentation of the coup that would serve as both proof of Yasmin's victory and insurance against anyone who might question his authority. Yasmin had made his first calls from Wesson's own desk, sitting in the leather chair that still held the impression of the previous occupant's weight, using Wesson's secure phone line to reach out to crew leaders across the region. Each conversation had been brief, authoritative, designed to establish the new reality before anyone had time to organize resistance or doubt. "This is Jasmine Dixon. As of tonight, I'm running operations. Wesson's out. The transition is complete and it's non-negotiable." He delivered that same message 7 times, to 7 different crew leaders, and the responses had been surprisingly uniform. Acknowledgement. Acceptance. A few questions about operational details, but no challenges to his authority. No expressions of loyalty to the deposed boss. Just pragmatic recognition that power had shifted, and that the smart move was to fall in line with the new regime. By midnight, Yasmin had made promises to 15 different people. Marcus would get elevated to underboss, second in command of the entire operation, with authority over crew assignments. Tyler would take over enforcement and security, with a budget increase for recruiting more soldiers. Dimitri would handle logistics and distribution, with expansion rights into territories Wesson had always kept restricted. Vanessa would run intelligence operations with direct access to all information networks. The expansion plans had flowed easily, fueled by bourbon and adrenaline and the intoxicating rush of absolute authority. The Atlantic City casino deal that Wesson had turned down? Yasmin would accept it, negotiate better terms, and establish a major gambling operation that would triple their revenue from that sector. The Mexican cartel distribution route? Jasmine would make that partnership happen, securing direct access to product without the middlemen who'd been taking cuts. The Brooklyn territories the Italian crew wanted? They'd get them as promised, which would cement their loyalty and demonstrate that Jasmine kept his word to allies. Vincent had called around 12:30 to confirm that the South Side operation was fully aligned with the new leadership. The Italian crew's representative had sent a message of support. Even the Colombians had reached out through back channels to express interest in expanding their business relationship now that more flexible management was in place. Everything was falling into position exactly as Jasmine had planned. The empire he'd envisioned was becoming reality, and the old guard who'd held it back was gone. Wesson Woodward was either in federal custody or in a shallow grave, depending on which option Marcus's associates had chosen during that van ride. And either way, he was no longer relevant to the future Jasmine was building. The penthouse had become party central by 1 in the morning. Music playing from Wesson's expensive sound system. More of the crew arriving to celebrate, bringing bottles and food, treating the space like it had always belonged to them. Jasmine had moved from the office to the living room, holding court from Wesson's favorite chair, accepting congratulations and loyalty pledges, basking in the respect and fear and admiration that his successful coup had generated. Marcus approached around 1:15, drink in hand, grinning with the satisfied expression of someone who'd bet everything on the right horse. "Boss, I've been going through the files in the office. There's more here than we thought. Way more. Wesson had holdings we didn't even know about. Shell companies, investment accounts, real estate portfolios. This empire is bigger than anyone realized." Jasmine had felt his confidence surge even higher. Of course it was bigger. Wesson had been running things for 30 years. The old man had accumulated wealth and power that Jasmine was only beginning to understand the scope of. And now all of it belonged to him. But then Marcus's expression had shifted slightly, confidence giving way to something that looked almost like confusion. "There's just one weird thing," he'd added, pulling out his phone. "I've been trying to access some of the offshore accounts using the codes we found in the office safe, but I keep getting connection errors. And there are these encrypted calls that came in about 20 minutes ago, like 6 or 7 of them, but when I try to call back, the numbers won't connect." Jasmine had felt the first flutter of unease in his stomach, so faint he'd almost dismissed it as paranoia. "What kind of connection errors?" "I don't know. Just system unavailable messages. Could be nothing. Maybe security protocols that lock down after business hours or something. I'll try again in the morning when the banks are actually open." Marcus had shrugged, already half dismissing his own concern. Probably just technical stuff. And the encrypted calls? No idea. They came in on the secure line in the office, but there's no callback option. Just notification that calls were received? Could be automated systems, could be contacts trying to reach Wesson. I wouldn't worry about it. But something about Marcus's tone suggested he was worrying about it, even if he was trying to convince himself not to. And Jasmine, despite the bourbon and the victory and the euphoria of claiming an empire, felt that flutter of unease grow slightly stronger. Tyler had appeared in the doorway then, his expression uncertain. "Boss, we've got a small issue with the security system. Some of the external cameras keep cycling offline and back online, like there's interference or something, and the perimeter sensors are showing activity in patterns that don't make sense, like phantom contacts that disappear before we can verify them." "Technical glitches," Jasmine had said, forcing confidence into his voice. "Old system. Probably needs updating. We'll get professionals in tomorrow to do a complete overhaul." Tyler had nodded, accepting the explanation, and headed back to the security room. Marcus had returned to the office files, and Jasmine had poured himself another drink, telling himself that the unease he felt was just the normal anxiety that came with massive change, with taking on enormous responsibility, with claiming power that came with pressure and risk. The first call came at 6:45 the next morning, Yasmin had fallen asleep in Wesson's master bedroom around 3, still wearing his clothes, the platinum watch heavy on his wrist, and he'd woken to his phone buzzing with a number he recognized immediately. Carlo Messina, one of the Italian crew's senior lieutenants who'd been at the warehouse last night, who'd stood and watched Wesson being dragged away, who'd nodded with approval when Yasmin had announced the new regime. "We need to talk," Carlo had said, his voice tight with something that sounded uncomfortably like panic. "Not on this line, not digital. In person, but not in the city. I'm leaving town for a few days, family emergency, but when I get back we'll meet somewhere safe and I'll explain everything." "Family emergency?" Yasmin had repeated, still foggy with sleep and bourbon hangover. "Carlo, we just took over an empire. This is the worst possible time for anyone to be leaving town." I know, and I'm sorry, but this can't wait. My mother, she's in the hospital and I have to go. 2 days, maybe 3, and then I'll be back and we'll talk." The words had come fast, rehearsed, like Carlo was reading from a script. And then he disconnected before Yasmin could ask any follow-up questions. By 9 in the morning, 3 more calls had come in. Vincent from the South Side operation saying he needed to handle some urgent business in Miami and would be unreachable for the next 72 hours. One of the Colombian representatives claiming transportation issues and suggesting they postpone their partnership discussions until next week. Even one of Jasmine's own crew members, a soldier named Derek, who'd been with him for 2 years, calling to say his girlfriend was having a medical crisis and he needed to drive upstate immediately. Marcus had noticed it too. "Boss, something's weird. That's 4 people in 3 hours all suddenly having emergencies that take them out of the city. That's not coincidence, that's pattern." Yasmin had tried to push down the unease that was growing in his chest. "People have emergencies. Life happens. They'll be back in a few days and we'll move forward." But by noon, the count had risen to 7. 7 key people who'd been at the warehouse last night, who'd supported the coup, who'd pledged loyalty to the new leadership, all suddenly finding reasons to leave town or become temporarily unreachable. And none of them were answering follow-up calls. Their phones went straight to voicemail or rang endlessly without anyone picking up. Vanessa had spent the morning trying to reach her network of information sources, the contacts who usually provided intelligence about police movements and rival operations and federal investigations. Out of 12 people she'd reached out to, only 2 had responded, and both had been vague and unhelpful in ways that suggested they were deliberately withholding information. "Something's happening," Vanessa had said, her usual confidence replaced by visible anxiety. "The whole network feels wrong, like everyone knows something we don't, and they're all pulling back at the same time." The offshore accounts had been Jasmine's next concern. Marcus had been trying since 8 that morning to access the Cayman Islands accounts they'd found documentation for in Wesson's office safe. 12 different account numbers, access codes that should have worked, authentication protocols that Marcus had followed exactly. And every single attempt had returned the same result: account not found or access denied. "It doesn't make sense," Marcus had said, staring at his laptop screen with growing frustration. "These accounts exist. The documentation is right here. The codes are correct, but the banking system is acting like they don't exist or like we don't have authorization to access them." Yasmin had taken over personally, trying different approaches, different authentication methods, even calling the private banking numbers listed in Wesson's files. The customer service representatives had been polite but unhelpful. "I'm sorry, sir, but without proper verification documents, I cannot confirm whether these accounts exist or provide any information about their status. I have the account numbers right here. I have the access codes. What other verification do you need?" "I'm afraid I cannot assist further without documentation establishing your legal authority to access these accounts. If you believe you should have access, I'd recommend consulting with legal counsel about the proper procedures for account recovery." Legal counsel. Proper procedures. Words that meant nothing in the criminal world where authorization came from power rather than paperwork. And the accounts that should have held millions, that should have been Yasmin's war chest for expansion and consolidation, were either empty or locked behind barriers he couldn't penetrate. By mid-afternoon, the safe house reports had started coming in. The Brooklyn location was reporting power fluctuations that kept triggering the security system. The Queens facility had experienced what the caretaker described as some kind of network intrusion attempt that had caused all the digital locks to reset to factory defaults. The Bronx safe house had surveillance cameras that were recording nothing but static since around 4 that morning. And the New Jersey property, the one Jasmine had personally used as a meeting location dozens of times, had been quietly evacuated by its security team, who'd left a note saying they'd detected federal surveillance in the area and were relocating to safer positions. Every report came with technical explanations: power grid issues, internet service disruptions, equipment malfunctions, potential law enforcement activity. Each individual incident had a plausible, mundane explanation that could be dismissed as coincidence or bad luck. But taken together, the pattern was undeniable. Every safe house, every secure location, every facility that Yasmin had thought was now under his control, all of them were simultaneously experiencing problems that rendered them unreliable or unusable. Tyler had spent 3 hours trying to coordinate responses, sending teams to check on facilities, attempting to diagnose and fix the technical issues. But every solution seemed to create new problems: locks that wouldn't reset, cameras that wouldn't reboot, security systems that refused to accept new authentication credentials. It was like the entire infrastructure was rejecting Jasmin's authority, refusing to acknowledge him as the new owner. "It's sabotage," Dimitri had said around 5 o'clock, his frustration boiling over into anger. "Someone's deliberately screwing with our systems, someone who has access to our networks, who knows our protocols, who's systematically shutting us down." "Who?" Yasmin had demanded. "Wesson's in custody or dead. His 3 guards are neutralized. Who has the knowledge and access to do this?" Nobody had an answer, and that was perhaps the most unsettling part. They'd eliminated the leader, secured the cooperation of every major crew, claimed the physical assets and infrastructure. In theory, there should be nobody left with the capability to mount coordinated resistance. And yet someone was clearly acting against them with precision and insider knowledge that should have been impossible. Yasmin had returned to the penthouse as evening approached, his earlier euphoria completely replaced by a gnawing anxiety that made his stomach tight and his hands shake slightly when he poured himself another drink from Wesson's bourbon collection. The watch on his wrist suddenly felt less like a trophy and more like evidence of a crime he didn't fully understand yet. The penthouse that had seemed like a palace last night now felt exposed, vulnerable, like he was standing in someone else's space without permission. Marcus found him standing at the windows, looking out at the Manhattan skyline as lights began flickering on across the city. "Boss, I think we need to consider the possibility that this wasn't as clean as we thought. That maybe Wesson had contingencies we didn't account for. That maybe..." His phone rang. Then Jasmin's phone. Then Tyler's and Dimitri's and Vanessa's. All at once. All with the same caller ID, unknown number. Jasmin stared at his phone for 3 rings before answering. Every instinct screamed at him not to pick up. That nothing good could come from an unknown caller at this specific moment, when everything was simultaneously falling apart. But the alternative was worse. Standing there paralyzed, while Marcus and Tyler and Dimitri and Vanessa all watched him, waiting to see if their new boss had the courage to answer his own phone. He swiped to accept the call and raised it to his ear, forcing his voice to sound steady and authoritative, despite the anxiety clawing at his chest. "Who is this?" There was a pause, just long enough to make Yasmin's heart rate spike, and then a voice he recognized instantly came through the speaker. Calm, measured, utterly unbothered. "Yasmin, I think it's time we had a conversation about who really owns what." Wesson Woodward's voice, clear and strong and completely unharmed, without any of the weakness or fear or defeat that should have been there if he was calling from federal custody, or speaking under duress from whatever hole Marcus's people had thrown him into. He sounded like a man sitting comfortably in his own office, perhaps enjoying his own bourbon. Certainly not like someone who'd been beaten and bound and thrown into a van less than 24 hours ago. Yasmin felt his blood turn to ice. Around him, he saw his crew react to whatever expression had crossed his face. Marcus stepping closer, Tyler's hand moving toward his weapon, Dimitri's eyes going wide with the beginning of understanding. "You're supposed to be—" Yasmin started, then stopped himself. Supposed to be what? In custody? Dead? Broken? None of those things were true, clearly, and saying them out loud would only expose how completely he'd miscalculated. Supposed to be neutralized? Wesson finished for him, a hint of amusement in his tone that made Yasmin's stomach churn. Is that what you thought? That throwing me in a van with some zip ties and theatrical blood was going to end my involvement in my own organization? The van took you. The van took me exactly where I wanted to go, Wesson interrupted, still calm, still controlled. To a secure location where I could watch the rest of the evening's entertainment unfold. You performed admirably, Yasmin, really. The speech in the warehouse was particularly good, very dramatic, very convincing. I almost believed you'd actually thought this through. Yasmin's mind raced, trying to process what he was hearing, trying to reconcile the voice on the phone with the man he'd watched being beaten and restrained and humiliated. The blood was real. Your guards were disarmed. You were bound. Theater, Wesson said simply. All of it. The guard you thought you overpowered? They're sitting in my office right now, completely unharmed, receiving bonuses for excellent performance under pressure. The blood came from a razor blade that one of your own enforcers was kind enough to apply exactly as instructed. And those zip ties? They were cut off approximately 3 minutes after the van pulled out of your sight line. The penthouse suddenly felt very small and very exposed. Yasmin looked around at his crew, saw the same dawning horror on their faces that he felt crystallizing in his chest. Marcus had gone pale. Tyler looked like he might be sick. Vanessa had her hand over her mouth, eyes wide with the expression of someone watching their entire world collapse. You're lying, Yasmin said, but the words came out weak, uncertain. The crews supported the coup. Vincent, the Italians, the Colombians, they all backed me. I had 35 armed men in that warehouse. You had 35 of my employees in that warehouse, Wesson corrected, his voice taking on an edge that made it clear he was done being patient. Vincent has been on my payroll for 12 years. The Italian crew? I established them 15 years ago as a subsidiary operation. The Colombians answer to a distribution network that reports directly to me. Every person you thought you'd recruited, every alliance you thought you'd secured, every soldier who stood in that warehouse pointing guns at my guards. All of them work for me, Yasmin. All of them have always worked for me. And every single one of them reported every conversation you had, every plan you made, every move you considered, directly back to my organization. The room spun slightly. Yasmin grabbed the back of Wesson's chair to steady himself, his legs suddenly feeling unreliable. That's impossible. I planned for months. I was careful. I verified. You verified exactly what I wanted you to verify, Wesson said. You saw exactly what I needed you to see. Because 6 months ago, when I started noticing certain indicators that suggested you might be developing ambitions beyond your station, I initiated a loyalty test. A comprehensive, organization-wide assessment designed to identify who valued power over principles, who would betray their family for personal gain, who represented the kind of cancer that needed to be identified and eliminated before it could spread. Yasmin heard Marcus make a sound like a wounded animal. Saw Tyler sink into a chair, his weapon forgotten. Vanessa was crying silently, tears running down her face as she realized the scope of their mistake. You set me up, Yasmin whispered. I created an opportunity for you to reveal your character, Wesson replied, You could have come to me with concerns about our operational approach, could have made a case for expansion using legitimate channels and proper respect for the chain of command, could have demonstrated patience and loyalty, and earned advancement through merit rather than betrayal. Instead, you chose conspiracy. You chose coup. You chose to film yourself mocking a man you believed was defeated while standing in a warehouse he actually owns, surrounded by soldiers who were documenting every word you said for my review. The phones of his crew members were ringing now too. Marcus looked at his screen and made a sound of pure despair. Tyler's phone kept buzzing with incoming messages. Dimitri had actually answered his call and immediately turned even paler, if that was possible, listening to whatever voice was on the other end. "The offshore accounts," Jasmine said, pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. "They were never accessible." "They exist," Wesson confirmed, "but you never had legitimate authorization to access them. Neither did anyone else in your little conspiracy. Those accounts require authentication that goes through my personal security protocols, which you triggered approximately 37 times this morning, alerting me each time someone attempted unauthorized access. The safe houses also exist, also remain under my control, despite your attempt to claim them. The technical issues your people reported? Those were my security teams remotely locking you out of facilities you never actually had authority to enter. The people leaving town are people with enough intelligence to recognize when they've been caught participating in a failed coup and enough survival instinct to remove themselves from the immediate blast radius before consequences arrive." Wesson paused, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone cold in a way that made Jasmine's hands shake. "Which brings us to the present moment, to this penthouse where you're currently standing, to the watch you're wearing that has a GPS tracker embedded in the band, to the bourbon you've been drinking that cost $8,000 a bottle, to the chair you're leaning on that I've sat in for 15 years, to the empire you thought you'd conquered that you never even understood existed." There was the sound of a door opening on Wesson's end of the call. Footsteps, multiple people entering a room, and then Wesson's voice again, final and absolute. "Look out your windows, Jasmine. The vehicles arriving at the building right now? Those are my actual security personnel. The ones I use when theater is over, and real business needs to be conducted. You have approximately 3 minutes before they reach the penthouse. I'd suggest you use that time to consider whether you want to spend those minutes running or facing the consequences of your choices with whatever dignity you have left." The 3 minutes Wesson had given him felt like 3 seconds. Jasmine stood frozen at the windows, watching the tactical teams enter the building lobby with the kind of coordinated precision that spoke of serious training and serious purpose, while his mind tried desperately to process the scope of what he'd just learned. Behind him, his crew was falling apart. Marcus had collapsed into a chair, head in his hands, making sounds that might have been prayers or curses. Tyler was on his phone trying to reach people who weren't answering. Dimitri had gone completely still, the kind of stillness that came from shock so complete it shut down all normal functions. Vanessa was still crying, mascara running down her face, her carefully maintained composure shattered beyond repair. The penthouse intercom buzzed. A voice Jasmine didn't recognize, professional and emotionless, announced, "Building security. We need access to the penthouse. Please open the door or we will be forced to override the locks." Jasmine's hand moved toward the door release button, then stopped. What was the point of making them break in? What was the point of any resistance when Wesson had just systematically demonstrated that every assumption Jasmine had made about power and control and authority had been fundamentally wrong from the beginning? He pressed the button, heard the lock disengage, watched the door swing open to admit 8 men in tactical gear who moved through the space with the efficiency of people who knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly where to find it. They weren't aggressive or violent. They simply positioned themselves at strategic points throughout the penthouse, securing exits and establishing control with minimal fuss or drama. The message was clear. This was a professional operation conducted by professionals who didn't need to posture or threaten because their authority was absolute and unquestionable. The last person through the door was Wesson Woodward himself. No blood on his face now. No torn suit or zip tie marks on his wrists. He wore a fresh charcoal suit that looked like it had been pressed within the last hour, his platinum watch back on his wrist where it belonged, his bearing radiating the kind of calm authority that Jasmine had mistaken for weakness, but now recognized as the confidence of someone who'd spent 30 years building something so comprehensive that temporary setbacks were merely theatrical interludes rather than genuine threats. Wesson walked directly to his chair, the one Jasmine had been sitting in, claiming as his own, and settled into it with the ease of someone returning home after a brief trip. He gestured to the sofa across from him in a clear invitation for Jasmine to sit, though it was the kind of invitation that wasn't really optional. Jasmine sat. His crew remained where they were, scattered around the penthouse like survivors of a shipwreck, clinging to whatever debris they'd managed to grab. Wesson looked at each of them in turn, his expression neutral but his eyes cataloging everything. And then he began to speak in that same measured tone he'd used on the phone. "Let me explain something about structure," Wesson said, "about how real power works in this business, because I think you fundamentally misunderstood what you were part of, what you attempted to take over, and why your failure was inevitable from the moment you started planning." He leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed, completely in control. "The Woodward Syndicate isn't a gang, Jasmine. It's not a crew or an operation or a regional organization. It's a comprehensive criminal enterprise that I built over 30 years, piece by piece, layer by layer, with the kind of patience and strategic thinking that you clearly lack. It controls every significant illegal operation in the northeastern United States and has connections extending to Europe, South America, and Asia. The annual revenue is measured in billions, not millions. The number of people employed either directly or indirectly through subsidiary operations is somewhere north of 3,000. And the structure is designed specifically to prevent exactly what you attempted last night. A coup by someone who thinks visible power equals actual authority." Marcus made a sound like he'd been punched. Wesson glanced at him with something that might have been sympathy or might have been contempt, then continued. "Every gang you know, every crew you've worked with, every operation you've participated in, all of it answers to the syndicate through carefully structured layers designed to maintain operational security and prevent any single point of failure. Vincent's South Side operation? That's Layer 3 in the distribution network. The Italian crew? Layer 2 in the enforcement division. The Colombians you thought were independent suppliers? They're actually part of a supply chain coordination system that I established 8 years ago to streamline product acquisition and reduce costs. Even your own crew, Jasmine, was recruited and vetted through syndicate protocols. I knew your name before you knew mine. I approved your promotion to crew leader 4 years ago. I've been receiving reports on your performance, your personality, your ambitions, your weaknesses, every single week since then." Jasmine felt like he couldn't breathe. The scope of what Wesson was describing was so far beyond anything he'd imagined that his mind struggled to even process it. He'd thought he was planning a coup against a regional boss. He'd actually been trying to overthrow an empire he'd never even known existed. "This penthouse you've been celebrating in?" Wesson gestured around the space with casual authority. "The title is held by Woodward Holdings LLC, a shell company registered in Delaware that's 3 layers removed from my name, but that I control absolutely. The furniture, the art, the bourbon collection you've been helping yourself to, all of it is documented as assets of the syndicate, with an aggregate value of approximately $4 million. The watch you're wearing has a GPS tracker embedded in the band that's been reporting your location to my security team every 30 seconds since Dimitri took it off my wrist. Even the crew members you thought were yours, Marcus, Tyler, Dimitri, Vanessa, they were all recruited through channels that ultimately report back to me. Their background checks, their initial job interviews, their promotions, their assignments, Every step of their careers in this organization went through syndicate protocols that I established and control. He stood up, walked to the windows where Jasmine had been standing minutes earlier, and looked out at the Manhattan skyline with the expression of someone surveying property they owned. I've spent 3 decades building this, Jasmine, building systems that can't be overthrown by ambitious subordinates who mistake my discretion for weakness, building redundancies so that no single betrayal can bring down the structure, building a network so comprehensive that people can work within it for years without ever understanding its true scope or reach. You thought you were planning a coup against me. What you were actually doing was participating in a loyalty test that I initiated 6 months ago, when my security analysts flagged certain behavioral patterns suggesting you might be developing problematic ambitions. Wesson returned to his chair and poured himself 3 fingers of bourbon from the same bottle Jasmine had been drinking from, the same $8,000 1972 Macallan that now felt like another piece of evidence documenting the complete foolishness of believing he'd actually conquered anything. The older man took a slow sip, savoring it with the appreciation of someone who understood exactly what he was drinking, then set the glass down with deliberate care. "You want to know the real timeline?" Wesson asked, though it wasn't really a question. 6 months ago, my security analysts flagged unusual patterns in your behavior. Extended conversations with Vincent that went beyond operational necessity. Multiple encrypted calls to contacts outside your normal network. Changes in your spending habits that suggested you were accumulating liquid assets in preparation for something significant. Small things individually, but collectively they painted a picture of someone planning something they shouldn't be planning. He leaned forward slightly, his eyes fixed on Jasmine with the intensity of someone delivering a lecture that needed to be fully understood. Now, I could have simply eliminated you at that point. Had you disappeared, made an example that would discourage anyone else from developing similar ambitions. That's what a weaker leader would do. React with violence to any perceived threat. Crush dissent before it can organize. Rule through fear rather than structure. But that approach creates its own problems. It makes people better at hiding their betrayals rather than preventing them. It encourages conspiracy in the shadows, rather than loyalty in the light. Marcus had stopped making sounds, and was now listening with the horrified fascination of someone hearing their own death sentence being explained in calm, rational terms. Tyler had put his phone away, recognizing the futility of trying to reach anyone who might help. Dimitri and Vanessa sat close together on the couch, looking like shell-shocked survivors trying to process trauma they didn't have the framework to understand. "So instead of eliminating you," Wesson continued, "I designed a test, a comprehensive evaluation that would accomplish multiple objectives simultaneously. First, it would identify everyone in your network, not just you, but every person you trusted enough to involve in your conspiracy. Second, it would document the extent of your planning and ambition, creating a complete record of betrayal that could be used for organizational learning. Third, and most importantly, it would demonstrate to you and everyone watching exactly what happens when someone mistakes my discretion for weakness, my patience for vulnerability, my strategic thinking for inability to see threats." He took another sip of bourbon, completely relaxed, as if discussing a business strategy rather than a trap that had destroyed multiple lives. "I've played this game before you were born, Jasmine. I was running operations when you were still in elementary school. I've survived federal investigations, rival organization attacks, internal power struggles, economic collapses, and changes in political administration. Do you really think, after 30 years of that experience, that I would walk into a warehouse meeting without controlling every single variable? Without knowing exactly who would be there, what they were planning, how they intended to execute it?" The question hung in the air, rhetorical but devastating. Yasmin's mouth felt dry, his tongue thick and useless. Every word Wesson spoke was another hammer blow to whatever remained of his pride, his confidence, his sense of himself as intelligent and capable and worthy of leadership. "The meeting wasn't routine," Wesson said. It was specifically scheduled after my analysts confirmed you'd secured what you believed were adequate alliances to execute a coup. I wanted you to feel confident, prepared, ready to act. I wanted you surrounded by everyone who'd agreed to support your betrayal, so that when you sprang your trap, you'd expose your entire network in a single coordinated action that my people could document comprehensively. He stood again, this time walking to a cabinet near the window and pulling out a tablet that he'd apparently left there before the whole theater began. He tapped the screen a few times, then turned it to face Jasmine. The video playing showed the warehouse from an angle Jasmine hadn't known existed, a camera positioned high in the rafters that captured the entire space. He watched himself giving the signal, watched the soldiers emerge from the shadows, watched Wesson and his guards being surrounded and disarmed with theatrical precision. 4 cameras, Wesson said, positioned to capture every angle, every face, every action, all streaming in real time to a secure location 3 miles away where I was sitting with my actual security team, watching you perform exactly as predicted. The beating you witnessed? Choreographed. My guards knew exactly how to take falls that looked realistic without causing genuine injury. The blood? Dimitri applied it with that razor blade exactly where my makeup artist had instructed him to, in a pre-meeting conversation where he was offered $50,000 to participate in what he was told was a loyalty test. He accepted, by the way. Added his name to the list of people who'll face consequences. Dimitri made a sound like a dying animal. Jasmine looked at his enforcer with something between betrayal and understanding. They'd all been manipulated, all been used as actors in a play they didn't know they were performing. The van you threw me into? Wesson continued, scrolling to another video. This one showed the interior of the vehicle, and Jasmine watched with sick fascination as the beaten Wesson had his zip ties cut off within seconds of the doors closing, accepting a towel to wipe away the fake blood while chatting casually with the driver about timeline and next steps. That van went exactly where I needed it to go, to a facility where I cleaned up, changed clothes, and reviewed the footage of your celebration in this penthouse. I watched you drink my bourbon, wear my watch, sit in my chair, and make promises to my employees using authority you never possessed and never could possess. He set the tablet down on the table between them, the screen still showing footage from the warehouse, the moment when Jasmine had stood over the bound Wesson and delivered his speech about outdated loyalty and new regimes. The man you thought you were defeating wasn't even me. Not really. It was a performance I gave, a role I played, specifically designed to appeal to your particular combination of ambition and arrogance. I showed you what you wanted to see. An aging boss clinging to conservative methods, vulnerable to a well-executed coup, ready to be replaced by younger and hungrier leadership. And you saw exactly what I needed you to see because you were looking for it. Wesson picked up his bourbon glass again, studying the amber liquid in the light from the windows. The truth is, Jasmine, I could have prevented your coup at any point. Could have shut it down the moment you made your first approach to Vincent, or when you started building your alliance with the Italians, or at any of a dozen points where intervention would have been trivially easy. But prevention doesn't teach the lesson that needs to be taught. Prevention doesn't create the kind of organizational memory that discourages future betrayals. Prevention doesn't demonstrate the scope and depth of the empire you never understood existed. He finished his bourbon in a single swallow, set the glass down with finality, and looked directly at Jasmine with eyes that held no mercy, no sympathy, no room for negotiation or appeal. So I let you plan, let you build your alliances, let you feel confident and powerful and ready to claim an empire, and then I let you execute your coup exactly as you'd designed it, documenting every step, every conversation, every promise, every betrayal. Not because I was weak or vulnerable or blind to what was happening, but because I needed you to reveal yourself completely, needed your entire network exposed, needed everyone watching to understand what happens when someone forgets that the game they're playing has rules they don't control, and an opponent who's been mastering those rules since before they were born. Wesson reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone with the kind of casual deliberation that suggested what was about to happen had been planned down to the exact second. He glanced at the screen, nodded slightly as if confirming something with himself, then looked back at Jasmine and his crew with an expression that held no warmth, no mercy, no possibility of reprieve. "Protocol Judas," Wesson said simply, and pressed a single button on his phone. The effect was immediate and synchronized. Every phone in the room, Marcus's, Tyler's, Dimitri's, Vanessa's, and even the phones of the 2 remaining crew members who'd stayed in the penthouse through the confrontation, all began ringing simultaneously with that same priority alert tone that had preceded Wesson's call. Jasmine watched his people look at their screens with expressions that shifted from confusion to horror as they read the caller identification. Marcus answered first, his hand shaking as he raised the phone to his ear. "Hello?" His voice cracked on the single word. Then he listened, his face draining of whatever color remained, his body seeming to collapse in on itself as whoever was on the other end delivered their message. The call lasted maybe 30 seconds before disconnecting, leaving Marcus staring at his phone like it had transformed into a venomous snake. Tyler answered next, his military training keeping his voice steady even as fear flickered in his eyes. "This is Tyler." He listened for perhaps 20 seconds, and Jasmine saw the exact moment when the message registered, the way Tyler's jaw clenched, the way his free hand formed a fist, the way his entire posture shifted from defensive readiness to defeated acceptance. "Understood," he said finally, and disconnected. Dimitri and Vanessa answered their calls together, sitting side by side on the couch like condemned prisoners awaiting execution. They listened to their respective messages in silence, and when the calls ended, Vanessa started crying again, while Dimitri just stared at the floor with eyes that had gone empty and dead. "What did they tell you?" Jasmine asked, though some part of him already knew the answer. Already understood that whatever Protocol Judas entailed, it was comprehensive and devastating, and designed to leave nothing salvageable from the wreckage of their failed coup. Marcus spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. "Terminated, effective immediately, severed from the organization with extreme prejudice, all access revoked, all protection withdrawn, all associations dissolved, status changed to hostile, fair game for any interested parties." He looked up at Jasmine with eyes that held accusation and despair in equal measure. "We followed you. We trusted your plan. And now we're marked across the entire network as traitors who participated in a failed coup against the syndicate." Tyler nodded grimly. Same message, word for word, like it was scripted. He glanced at Wesson with something that might have been respect, or might have been hatred. "How long has this protocol existed?" 15 years, Wesson replied. "Developed after a previous internal betrayal, taught me the importance of having rapid response procedures for severing cancerous elements from the organizational body. Protocol Judas specifically targets everyone who participated in a coup attempt, terminating their employment, revoking their access to resources and protection, and broadcasting their status across the network to ensure no one offers them sanctuary or support." He walked to the windows again, looking out at the city with the air of someone discussing abstract business strategy, rather than the destruction of human lives. As I speak, similar calls are being placed to every person who supported Jasmine's coup. Vincent is receiving his termination notice. The Italian crew leaders are being informed their subsidiary operation is dissolved, and they're being investigated for conspiracy. The Colombian representatives are being notified that their distribution agreement is cancelled, and they're banned from syndicate territories. Every soldier who stood in that warehouse pointing a weapon at my guards is being contacted and given the same message. Terminated, marked, unprotected. Yasmin's own phone buzzed with an incoming message. He looked at the screen with dread and saw a notification from his offshore bank. The personal account he'd set up years ago. Separate from any organizational resources, funded with money he'd carefully skimmed and saved. The message was brief. Account closure notification. Balance transferred per court order. Current balance, 0. How? He started, but Wesson cut him off. I've known about that account since you opened it 4 years ago. Tracked every deposit, every withdrawal, every transfer. The moment Protocol Judas was initiated, legal documents were filed seizing those funds as proceeds from criminal conspiracy. Not just yours, every account belonging to everyone who participated in your coup. Personal savings, investment portfolios, hidden cash reserves, all of it identified, documented, and seized or frozen. The legal paperwork has been in preparation for 6 months, ready to be filed the instant you demonstrated your betrayal was serious rather than theoretical. Marcus tried his phone again, attempting to access something on a banking app. The screen showed an error message. He tried another app, another account. Same result. Everything's frozen, everything. Even the accounts I thought were completely separate from any organizational connection. Nothing is separate when you work for the syndicate, Wesson said. That's a lesson you're learning too late to benefit from. Every resource you thought was yours was actually identified and monitored from the moment it was created. Every safe deposit box, every cash stash, every backup plan you thought provided independence, all of it was known, documented, and prepared for seizure the moment you proved you couldn't be trusted. Tyler stood and walked to the window, looking down at the street where more vehicles had arrived. There are at least 15 SUVs down there now, and I recognize some of those men. Those are the real elite guard, the ones who handle high-level security and enforcement operations, the ones we never actually met because we weren't important enough to require their attention. Correct, Wesson confirmed. They're currently deploying to every location associated with Jasmine's operation. The warehouse where you celebrated your victory is being seized. The safe houses you thought you controlled are being cleared and locked down. The vehicles registered to your crew are being impounded. The equipment, weapons, and resources you believed were yours are being inventoried and reassigned to legitimate operations. By morning, there will be no physical evidence that Jasmine's crew ever existed as an independent entity. Vanessa looked up from her phone, mascara-stained face showing the full weight of understanding. My contacts aren't responding. Any of them. Every person in my network has either blocked me or their numbers are disconnected. It's like I've been erased from every database, every connection, every relationship I've built over 10 years in this business. You have been, Wesson said. Protocol Judas includes network-wide notification of termination status. Every legitimate member of the syndicate has received alerts identifying you, and everyone who participated in the coup as hostile actors whose status has changed from protected to unprotected. In our world, that designation is a death sentence. Not necessarily literal, though it could be, depending on who encounters you and what grudges they might hold, but certainly professional and financial. You're marked, burned, finished. The room felt smaller suddenly, the walls pressing in as the full scope of Protocol Judas became clear. This wasn't just termination from a job. This was systematic erasure from an entire world, comprehensive destruction of every connection and resource that had made life in the criminal underworld possible. Yasmin and his crew weren't just unemployed. They were marked as traitors in a community where betrayal was the unforgivable sin, stripped of protection in an environment where protection was the difference between life and death. Wesson stood and buttoned his suit jacket with the kind of precise, unhurried movement that communicated absolute control and zero concern for anything these broken people in his penthouse might attempt. His security detail remained positioned at strategic points throughout the space. Professional, alert, but not aggressive. They didn't need to be. The threat had already been neutralized not through violence, but through the systematic dismantling of every foundation Jasmine and his crew had believed supported their existence. I want to be very clear about what happens next, Wesson said, his voice carrying the weight of final judgment delivered by someone with the authority to make it absolute. Because I think there might be some confusion about your immediate future, and I don't want any misunderstandings that could lead to poor decisions on your part. He walked slowly around the room, making eye contact with each person in turn. Marcus, Tyler, Dimitri, Vanessa, the two remaining soldiers who looked like they wished they could disappear into the expensive hardwood floor. When he reached Yasmin, he stopped and studied him with the clinical detachment of a scientist examining a failed experiment. "Some of you might be thinking that I'm going to have you killed," Wesson said. "That this confrontation ends with violence, with bodies disappearing, with the kind of brutal conclusion that makes sense in the stories people tell about organized crime. And I'll admit, that would be the traditional approach. Clean, efficient, sends a clear message to anyone else who might develop similar ambitions." He paused, letting that possibility hang in the air for a long moment while Jasmine's heart hammered against his ribs and cold sweat ran down his back, despite the climate-controlled comfort of the penthouse. "But I'm not going to kill you," Wesson continued, and somehow that statement was more terrifying than any threat of violence could have been. Killing you would be mercy. It would be quick, final, an ending to your suffering and fear. It would let you escape the consequences of your choices and avoid living with the full weight of what you've done. He turned away from Jasmine and walked back toward his chair, settling into it with the ease of someone reclaiming property that had never actually been lost. "Instead, I'm going to do something much more effective. I'm going to let you live. Let you walk out of this building. Let you try to survive in the world you thought you understood but never actually did." Marcus made a sound of confusion or hope, or possibly both. Wesson glanced at him with something that might have been pity. "You're all free to leave?" Wesson said, gesturing toward the door with casual authority. "Right now. Walk out of this penthouse, out of this building, go anywhere you want. I won't stop you. My security won't touch you. You have my word on that." "But," Tyler started, then stopped, clearly unable to articulate the question that was struggling to form in his mind. "But what?" Wesson finished for him. "But where will you go? But how will you survive? But what happens when you encounter people who've received Protocol Judas notifications about your status?" He leaned back in his chair, completely relaxed. "Those are excellent questions. Let me help you understand the answers." He pulled up something on his phone and turned the screen to face the room. It showed a message, simple and direct. "Syndicate notice. Yasmin Dixon and associated personnel terminated with extreme prejudice for conspiracy against the Woodward Syndicate. Status: hostile, no protection, no sanctuary. Fair game for all interested parties." "That message went out 90 minutes ago to approximately 3,000 people," Wesson said. "Every crew leader, every enforcer, every connected criminal in the northeastern United States, and significant contacts beyond. They all know your names. They all know your faces, which helpfully you provided through all that filming and celebrating you did. They all understand that you attempted to betray the syndicate. And more importantly, they all understand that the syndicate no longer protects you." He set the phone down and fixed Yasmin with a look that held no warmth, no sympathy, no possibility of appeal. "You wanted to be a king, Yasmin. You wanted power and respect and authority. You wanted to sit in this chair, drink this bourbon, wear this watch, and command an empire. Well, congratulations, you got exactly what you deserved." The words landed like physical blows, each one precise and devastating. "Now you'll learn what it means to be nothing," Wesson continued, his voice taking on an edge of cold finality. "Every crew that operates in this city knows your face. Every corner, every territory, every operation from here to Boston, they all receive notification that you're marked. The places you used to walk safely, hostile territory now. The people who used to show you respect, they'll show you violence instead, or worse, they'll sell information about your location to people who hold grudges. The resources you thought you could access? Gone. The connections you believed would help you survive? Severed." He stood again, signaling that this conversation was reaching its conclusion. "You betrayed the man who built the world you were living in, Yasmin. You tried to take an empire from someone who spent 30 years constructing something you couldn't comprehend in 30 lifetimes. And now, every person who benefits from that empire, every soldier who draws a paycheck from that structure, every operator who enjoys protection under that umbrella. They all know what you did. They all understand that you're the cancer that was cut out. And they all know that there's no penalty for whatever they choose to do if they encounter you. Marcus stood slowly, testing whether movement was actually permitted or whether Wesson's promise of freedom was another layer of psychological torture. When no one stopped him, he took a hesitant step toward the door. "Go ahead," Wesson said, gesturing permission. "All of you. Leave. Try to figure out how to survive in a world where everyone knows you're traitors and nobody's obligated to show you mercy." Tyler followed Marcus, then Dimitri and Vanessa, then the two remaining soldiers. They moved like people leaving a funeral, defeated and hollow and uncertain whether survival was even possible. Only Yasmin remained sitting, the watch heavy on his wrist, staring at the man who'd orchestrated his complete destruction without raising his voice or making a single threat. "You're not going?" Wesson asked. "Where would I go?" Yasmin's voice came out broken, barely recognizable as his own. "Anywhere. Nowhere. It doesn't matter to me." Wesson walked to the door, where his security detail waited. "Run fast, Yasmin. Run far. Change your name, your appearance, your entire identity if you think it will help. But understand that my empire is everywhere. The syndicate's reach extends further than you ever knew, deeper than you ever imagined. And in that world, the real world you never understood, you're not a king, or a leader, or even a player. You're prey. Fair game. A cautionary tale about what happens when ambition exceeds understanding." He paused in the doorway, looking back one final time. "The penthouse lease ends in 30 days. The building management has been notified you're no longer an authorized resident. I'd suggest you use whatever time you have left to get as far away from my city as possible. Because every day you remain is another chance for someone to recognize you, to remember that Protocol Judas notification, to decide that there might be reward or favor to be gained by dealing with the traitor who tried to overthrow the syndicate." Then Wesson walked out, his security detail following in disciplined formation, leaving Jasmine alone in the penthouse that had never belonged to him, surrounded by expensive furniture and art and bourbon he'd never actually owned, wearing a watch that had been tracking his every movement since he'd claimed it as a trophy, sitting in a chair that still held the impression of the man who'd spent 15 years planning exactly how to destroy people who made exactly the mistakes Jasmine had made. The silence after they left was absolute and crushing. Yasmin sat there for a long time, minutes or hours, he couldn't tell, staring at the Manhattan skyline and understanding with perfect, terrible clarity that he wasn't looking at a kingdom he'd failed to claim. He was looking at a hunting ground where he was now the prey, marked and unprotected, in an empire so vast and comprehensive that there was nowhere in this world he could run where Wesson's reach wouldn't eventually find him. Thank you for watching this story to the end. If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as can ever imagine. So do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one.